Welcome, folks, to the edition of Book Bites from the Center for Preaching. One of the purposes of putting together these occasional lunches is that we're wanting folks to think about how the various publications of our faculty can help us to think about preaching. Preaching and here theology, biblical theology of preaching, of creation and new creation. How does that work together? And we have today Dr. Sean McDonough, professor of New Testament, with us. And we're going to talk about his book that's forthcoming here from Hendrickson. This is a Paternoster Press edition here. If you want to go overseas and paddle over or whatever to get a copy of this. But it's Creation and New Creation, Understanding God's Creation Project. And on the tables, you'll see these flyers here that are produced by Hendrickson on this side of the ocean. So welcome, Sean.
Thanks.
And
I was going to say, if you take notes on the back, then you could fold it up and it could be a little mini book until the actual book emerges. So it's got the cover, and you just could kind of create it yourself. Just a pro tip there.
Oh, that's
no extra
handy,
charge
handy
for
dandy.
that. Yes.
That's great. But why don't we begin by talking about why this book? Why did you write this particular book?
The story is actually kind of funny because for several months I kept getting these emails that just said Alan, and then the tagline, the subject line was like, an interesting opportunity. So even without formal IT training, I said, I know a scam when I see one. This is just a complete, just trying to get my money or something, like a Nigerian oil princess. So I just kept deleting these emails. And then I got a call from, of all people, Gilles Demosthène down at CUME and said, there's this professor in Britain who's calling me trying to find you. He says he keeps sending you emails inviting you for this book project. And he finally resent it, and there's Alan, an interesting opportunity. And yeah, I opened it up, and sure enough, he had invited me to do this for a series on Christian doctrine and historical perspective. Why he wanted me to do it is anybody's guess. I'd done a book on Christ as Creator, which was almost purely New Testament, though there was a chapter on theology at the end. And so this is a much more historical, theological book with maybe, 20% biblical theological reflection, but it's much more historical. But he asked, and I said, sure, I'd be happy to do it. And the distinctive thing about the series that he was going after is, A, he wanted historical perspective on the doctrine, whether it's Christology or Trinity or whatever it is. He wanted to make sure we listened to the breadth of the church's witness through the ages. And then he also wanted to have this two-for-one thing. So it's the person and work of Christ is the Christology book. And this was going to be creation and new creation in a package. So that was sort of the distinctive.
Okay. And so you then took this great opportunity.
Yep, indeed.
And developed the book according to the series requirements itself. And so how did you then perceive how this would unfold in the development of the book itself?
Yeah, excellent question. And I've been poking around the doctrine of creation for decades now. As much as anything, just a prime research interest for me. So it was really a matter of just reading around, particularly more in the theological, historical realm, and just trying to see what sort of things popped up everywhere in the writings of the great theologians of the church about creation, and then hoping to find what I did in fact find, that they will often consciously or unconsciously connect it with motifs of new creation. And so as I bumbled my way along, I ended up taking a survey of maybe 10 major theologians or bunches of theologians, and kind of semi-consciously trying to make it a very ecumenical project. This, above all, this should be a doctrine that all Christians can gather around. So we had Irenaeus, who is in Lyon in France, but I still count him as an Eastern theologian. The Cappadocians, Basil the Great and Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory Nazianzen. Maximus Confessor, who is a Byzantine chap who sort of sums up a lot of the Eastern thought before that. Then for the Catholics, we've got Augustine, of course, or Augustine, depending on your preferences, and Aquinas. That was quite enough to be getting along with there. And for the Protestants, particularly Jonathan Edwards, whose writings are available free online, which is great for cutting and pasting for quotes. Oops. Is that my outline voice? And Karl Barth, and lots of other folks coming in, Luther and Calvin, and C.S. Lewis, Samuel Taylor, Coleridge, and all sorts of other folks popping in. But just, and again, looking for the consensus. Sure, there are variations and nuances, but really trying to say what has been believed by all, at all times, in every place. And I've happily found plenty of consensus, both on the creation and the new creation.
Right. And you note in the book that you decide to stop with Barth and for a little bit of distance from those. But you also saw the works of Gunton and others that contribute to the discussion.
Exactly. So Robert Jensen and Colin Gunton, Jürgen Moltmann, lots and lots of people who've influenced my thought, but we just wanted to get a little bit of a distance. So.
Now the preface itself, the book gives a real sense of what's going to take place in the book, and then the first chapter, the end is like the beginning, creation and new creation in Scripture and tradition. Dr. McDonough maps the book out basically and talks about Old Testament and New Testament and the way in which creation. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about how then the book unfolds? Sure,
and one of the most interesting things which Dr. Kaminsky helped tip me off to is I've been reading Genesis 1 through 3 since I've become a Christian, of course, and thinking about it with some professional attention for decades. But I never noticed that Adam is created outside of Eden. I just assumed, God creates Eden and grabs some dust from there. But he's put there. And I'm increasingly convinced that that's our first sign that the Adam story, in addition to being the story of the first person, in addition to being the story of humanity at large, is also the precursor to Israel's story, right? And of course, Israel's story is itself representative of God's story. And what we find is that the redemptive history of Israel is really saturated with imagery from the creation narrative there in chapter 1, and particularly the search for rest, the search for a return to the garden, to paradise, to the presence of God, really dominates the narrative. And both in Adam's and Israel's case, of course, that's left tragically open because there's this miserable failure to meet God's very reasonable commands. And that's why you need the New Testament, the new creation is the answer to that yearning. But think of the Sabbath narrative, 6 days of work and then rest. That's not in there haphazardly. That is Israel's desire to work towards some consummation. And yet, as Paul realizes in his own broad reading of the Scriptures, that consummation never arrives. We just get sin and death and exile until Jesus comes. And I think Irenaeus probably captures that better than anyone, particularly in the first several centuries of the church, and maybe as well as anyone ever. He does have that broad perspective. Unfortunately, because most of that is in his Against Heresies, which includes just copious amounts of horrible doctrine that Irenaeus had to oppose, and he's very fair to list it all out. You've got to kind of pick your way through the Adversus Heresies Against the Heresies to see this wonderful tapestry that Irenaeus discerns in the Scripture. He doesn't invent it, but he discerns it. And later generations have been more prone to strip mine the Scriptures for later deployment in various systems. The good theologians, the ones I deal with, never quite lose that narrative sweep, though.
So that first chapter then talks about how creation and new creation finds its place in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, all the way from Genesis to Revelation. And then the rest of the book deals with a number of different items, and maybe you want to talk about how you have it mapped out.
Yeah, I mean, probably whether I do it or not, what I want to say, the way it should be mapped out, at least for you guys to get a sense of the whole, and particularly for preaching, because one of the things you can do in preaching is give people the sense of the whole, to help them make connections. And, Sunday school teaching is great, and for somebody like me who's an explainer, in some ways it's optimal because I can go into granular detail about everything. There's no time limit. There's a lot of response. One of the beauties of preaching is you've got this fixed time to cast a vision for people, and they can't make you stop unless, I guess, you're truly horrible. But generally speaking, or if you go past the lunch hour, in which case, frankly, you deserve it. So, which is also why we serve the pizza first, and then we talk as a pro tip for any church event. You're able to cast a vision and give a coherent. That's the whole thing about having a big idea, is you're giving that one thing. And one of the one things you can give people regularly is a connection. And for me, we've got creation, fall, redemption, and that's wonderful. But I'd adapt that slightly to a four-part system of creation, God's positing of the universe, his making of all things, which includes making you and me. So there's a past sense of that, but it's also a continuous process. But then counter-creation, and this is often left out. Counter-creation is humanity's attempt to form a world in defiance of God, right? So it's not simply that you have a fall and people muck about and are so sad and hopeless and they wait for Jesus to come. No, they are actively trying to fulfill the promise of creation on their own. Of course, it shows up right there in the Tower of Babel very early, and it's no coincidence that Babel is Babylon, the great world empire that dominated the kind of intellectual landscape of Israel, which name is, of course, picked up in the book of Revelation for the Roman Empire and all wicked world empires. And parenthetically, I just think there's nothing better for your own understanding as a preacher, but also for the understanding of your people, particularly in the modern Western context. But because that's become so globalized, it's a broad application. That idea of Babylon, the counter-creation, which is in fact, on the surface, remarkably successful. Right? If you just think of people as fallen and powerless, you get confused and bewildered by Babylon. But the Bible's clear. There's this dynamic of counter-creation, which because those gifts have been given by God, there's a dynamism, there's a power, and therefore there's an allurement to that, and you really need to teach people that. So we've got creation, counter-creation. Decreation is the other thing that gets left out of this discourse a lot. Decreation is God's deliberate dismantling of the created order in response to the counter-creation.
And you mentioned that in the book as 2 Peter and Revelation.
Exactly, and that's sort of the dramatic end of the world stuff, but very pastorally relevant because people's lives fall apart, right? In all sorts of ways, biologically, emotionally, relationally. And if that is left out of your theological account of things, you're going to have on the surface something that coheres. Oh, the world was made and then it was a little bit bad, but Jesus came and made everything right. They're going to have a hard time relating that to how their life actually goes. But if you get the counter-creation, you get the decreation, then with the promise of recreation, beginning in your heart, transform, power of the gospel, extending into your ethic, your community life, culminating in bodily resurrection, new heaven and new earth, then I think you've got all the necessary ingredients for casting that theological vision. And also you have your own coherent conception so that if you're preaching on sin, for example, you won't be thinking narrowly in terms of here's the rule, don't break it. But you've got a nice big picture of what sin really is and how it manifests itself in this idolatrous manufacturing of a paradise that is not God's paradise and therefore is doomed to destruction.
So the book unfolds, and some of the things that you deal with, for example, the creation, 6-day creation, scientific types of things. How do you tackle that?
Yeah, and I think it's important to try to Now, partly because it was a self-consciously ecumenical enterprise, I'd be careful not to overstate things or simply say what my opinion is and act as if that were determinative for the church universal. That's part of the beauty, I think, of the arrangement of the series is you listen to everybody and say, what can we all agree on? So I bound the problem like this, particularly, let's say, Adam, right? So on the scientific side of things, you got people trying to trace DNA, and they get back to 10,000 proto-hominids or whatever, X number of years ago. And we want to respect that as a good faith effort to figure out what's going on in the world. If we posit that God has made the world, then surely we learn something about these connections by scientific investigation. The problem on that side is, how do you become a sense-making person? Right? We all see meaning in the world, even if we only see it by its absence. My life's meaningless, people cry. Well, how'd they get the idea that it could be meaningful? Where'd that come from? Yeah? Let alone a kind of primal sense that your life matters, you've got significance, you're important. I don't see how you evolve into that. Yeah? And so if you choose a purely scientific view of things, you got problems. Now, of course, the scientific view creates certain constraints on the literalist as well, that the world, by most scientific accounts, seems to be longer than 6,000 years old. So you just got to, I think, find a balance. You check your guns at the saloon door, right? That when somebody says, well, I had science class, could this be the case? You don't just shoot them right away. Try to engage them and just give the costs and benefits of certain perspective. So you got a 6,000-year-old creation, Adam as a random guy created by God who screws it up for the rest of us. That really doesn't do justice to the central thrust of what Genesis is getting at, because Adam's clearly a representative figure. And you can't just get back to Eden. Do you ever stop and think about that, right? If Moses was really interested in locating Eden precisely, then you just take your caravan and follow the directions, and eventually somebody would bump into this flaming sword of the cherub and all that. But that never happens, which should cause us to wonder what the nature of this peculiar narrative is. Is it straight history that's perfectly retraceable, or is it lost to us? And I tend to think it's gone, baby, gone, right? It's the season of Casey Affleck, so his first major starring role there. It's just gone. And so in the nature of the case, you couldn't scientifically retrieve it. That also puts limits on what you can know about it. You know what God wants us to know, which is when we look at Adam and Eve, the reason I take the narrative seriously, among many reasons, is it looks, yes, this is how people behave. This is how I behave, right? It's not, oh man, I'm constitutionally such a great guy. If only Adam hadn't put me in this bad situation, I'd be off the hook. And that's one way you could construe Genesis in a hyper-literalistic way. No, he's a representative figure who, at the very least, embodies what we all are like. I can be full-blown evolutionist. Well, I mean, scientifically, you got issues there, but again, how do we evolve into the image of God? So I sort of try to put some boundaries and give the church space to think through how they're going to sort it all out.
And so the different chapters unfold here. Let me ask you this. As far as the research and writing and putting this book together, what was the most challenging part of putting this book together? Let me ask that first.
Yeah, I mean, probably just feeling like a complete, not a fraud, but just you get this ocean of possibilities, right? And when you're doing research, you spent how many years of your life on A.J. Gordon, one Boston minister, right? So let's take Augustine, whose legacy is perhaps even greater than that of A.J. Gordon, right? Don't know. Arguably, we're just, for the sake of argument.
For the sake of argument,
right?
Okay.
And that's just one person I'm interested in looking at. So ultimately, though, that became liberating because I was like, there's no way anybody, let alone me, could master this stuff. So what I'm going to do is just read what I can, consult the experts in any given field, and particularly the strength of the book is that much of it is quotations from people who are a lot smarter than I am. So if some Augustine's caller wants to say, well, you fundamentally misunderstand, blah, blah, blah. This is what the dude wrote. Here it is, and I give some degree of interpretation, but we're really trying to present them to it. So it was a challenge which then became liberating when I realized there's no way I could master the material, but if I could be useful in presenting it to people with some coherence, then that would be a good thing.
And as you stated before, you had to provide some delimitations.
Yep.
Who you were going to include and who you were not going to.
Exactly.
And so that provides a little
Yeah.
bit. How about, what was the most enjoyable, fun part of writing this?
Yeah, probably just the research and being able to read all these different geniuses and just kind of revel in it. And there was fun, one guy who's a little out there, John Scotus Origina, who's an Irishman, so I had a particular affection for him. And he had this, he's quite a character. I can't remember who the emperor was. This is around 900, 800 AD. I think it might have been Charles the Bald. But he wanted to provoke John Scotus Origina a lot. He wanted to provoke him, joke with him. So he said, what's the difference between a Scot and a sot? A sot meaning a drunkard, right? And a Scot being a generic term for an Irishman. So just trying to rib him, saying all you Irish are drunk. Some things never change over the centuries. So John Scotus Origina looks back at him, and they're sitting opposite each other. He says, He says, what's the difference between a Scot and a sot? He says, only a table. So you're the drunkard, Charles the Bald. So he's a pretty saucy lad, and I like that. So that was very enjoyable. And just seeing, I guess the other thing, which is, on a more sober note, is seeing that the great theologians, what they're always doing is trying to interpret the scriptures. And they have different intellectual frameworks, different systems, but John Scotus Origina could spend 40 pages talking about how it's the case that God is everything, which seems like a kind of weird thing to want to defend in the first place, but he's reading 1 Corinthians 15:28, God will be all in all. He puts the stop with his tradition in the beginning. God will be all, in all. And the in all is shunted off the side for a while. So what does it mean that God is all? So even though it's a kind of aberrant path, although I think he makes it sort of orthodox, what he wants to do is interpret the Bible. Maximus Confessor, the Cappadocians, they all are committed to the scriptures. And really that's what makes a good theologian. And that's what's so troubling nowadays is you have people who are overtly or covertly just saying, well, who really cares what Paul says? And so that's a new dimension of heresy. John Scotus Origina is out there, but he still wants to preserve the Bible, and that gravitational pull means he doesn't get too far out there in faith and practice. And unfortunately, a lot of our contemporary theologians have decided that what they think of on their own in their office is preferable to some of the more unsavory aspects of Scripture, and that's death for the church.
And how then, when we're talking about exegesis for our sermons, how can this be applied to this framework of creation, new creation? How can that be applied to us in our thinking about working through biblical texts?
Excellent. And I think the key is that these writers were very theologically, biblically aware. And the details of the stories they tell are important. And they're always tying it into the bigger picture. They're not just throwing stuff out there randomly. It's part of a coherent theological vision. And there are different points of emphasis. Paul's not going to write exactly like James. Moses is going to be different from Hosea. But they are always, I think, seeing the big picture. And you need to as well. And you don't want to give your people the sense that God's word is a kind of randomized concatenation of a little bit of moral advice, some vague truths about God. No, it's coherent, it's detailed, it's thoughtful. And I would argue that creation is really what ties it together as well as anything. If I could be permitted an illustration, and if you've had me in class, you've heard this several times because I end up saying the same things in every class all the time. But nonetheless,
Say it again.
Say it again. When Israel is there in the first chapter of Exodus, right, we read, they were being fruitful and multiplying in the land, right? Now, if you're reading and preaching with an awareness of connections, your mind immediately goes back to Genesis, and it's supposed to go back to Genesis. And so Israel is in some way groping towards a fulfillment of the creation project. What's Pharaoh's response? Because Pharaoh's got his own creation project underway, the counter-creation. He's going to decreate Israel and kill all those rotten kids, right? Or at least the men, so they can't move forward as a nation. When Moses is born, and this is where it gets granular and really interesting, we read in various translations when Moses is born, it says, and when his mother saw that he was a fine child, right? And great, he was, they go to Walmart, get the baby pictures, a good-looking kid, we presume. But a literal translation, and this is why you need to learn your Hebrew and Greek, because things are easier when you do that. It's more obvious. If you're reading literally in Hebrew, what you're going to come upon is, and she saw him that he was good, he. Well, that should be a pretty obvious connection, again, back to Genesis 1. And that's exactly the connection we're supposed to make. Meanwhile, where does she put him after that? She puts him in his little basket. So you read it. That's how the Puritans would say it. But in the Chaldee, as they used to say, in Hebrew, the word is tevah. And the word tevah shows up in one other place in the whole Hebrew Bible, the story of Noah's Ark. So we've got the hope of Israel, and therefore the hope of the world, in his little ark floating on the threatening Nile waters. And what salvation? I was going to say Mrs. Pharaoh, but it's young Ms. Pharaoh draws him out of the water. And he goes on to write the Bible and star in films and all sorts of other things. So it's got a happy ending.
Well, let's open up some questions that you might have as
Spring right up.
back here and over here. So we'll start right over here.
How much did you interact with dispensationalism, if you did that at all in the book? And how did you think about doing that?
Hardly, not at all. Not at all as such. I dealt with, young earth creationism to say possible, I suppose, sure. But the problem with young earth creationism, as much as anything, is its name, right? Because it gives the impression that, well, the world hasn't really been around very long. You scientists say it's all these billions of years old, but it's really young. When you read the Psalms in particular, the psalmist suggests, to me at least, that when you look at the world, you're supposed to think it's really, really old, and we're really, really small, and God is older than that, if you could believe it. I mean, that's kind of colloquially. The hills, before the hills in order stood, is Isaac Watts' rendition of the psalm. Before the hills in order stood. You're supposed to think of these hills as just being around forever, and then you make the imaginative leap that God's even beyond that. Or think of the Job 38 and following. The older I get, the more they become my favorite chapters in the Bible. Who are you, Job? Who are you to question me about anything? Look at the world around you. It just goes on and on. Did you put the Pleiades up there? Can you tame Orion? Do you feed the hyrax or rock badger in his mountain? No. This world is so totally out of your control and beyond you that you should recognize just what a vapor and a mist you are. And there's an arrogance at times about so-called young earth creationism that we got everything under control. We know everything. It's very manageable. We got the Bible, the key to all this. The Bible itself throws us into this crisis of infinity whose only solution is clinging to the infinite, truly infinite God. So could the world be 10,000 years old? Sure, right? You go the whole 9 yards. But don't go telling me it's the young earth, because the Bible says something different. So I want to affirm the Bible.
There was a question right over there.
Okay, so I may have misheard you. And if I did, then let's just move on.
Yeah.
That I didn't ask this question. Did I hear you mention that there's something about Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the book?
Yes.
Okay, can you expand on that? And then, are there any other, I would say, non-theologians that you discuss in the book and their perspectives on creation? just because I'm curious. A lot of what you've discussed so far has been, historic and insignificant theologians. So anyway.
Yeah. And Coleridge is not a non-theologian, meaning he is a theologian. So he's most, best known as a poet, and particularly the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, parts of which you probably had to memorize in 7th grade. Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. So things stick with us. But Coleridge was, in fact, a very interesting, if I don't want to call him unorthodox, but maybe small u unorthodox thinker. And Gunton actually likes Coleridge a lot. That's sort of tipped me off. He's very interesting as a Christian Platonist. And one of the chapters of the book, which actually, most of this is not meant to be original. It's meant to cull the best of the tradition. But the one semi-original part is often in modern creation theology, good modern creation theology, there's this idea that Platonism kind of destroys the theology of creation. And what I argue there with Coleridge as one of the prime examples is that I just don't think it does. I think there are plenty of Christians who are overt Platonists like Coleridge or the Cambridge Platonists, which is one of my favorite parts of the book is everybody writes books about the Cambridge Platonists, this group of guys in the 1600s, and they all entitle them the Cambridge Platonists. So when I got to the 4th footnote of the 4th book entitled The Cambridge Platonists, I just had to write, evidently, creative titling is not a strong suit of Cambridge Platonist studies, because they just call it the Cambridge Platonists. But those guys call themselves Platonists and are called it. C.S. Lewis, another avowed Platonist, they all have an appreciation for the natural world, a love for the natural world. And then, the whole Orthodox tradition, you have Maximus Confessor right up to 20th century Sergius Bulgakov, one of my favorite contemporary theologians. They love the world and they appreciate its beauty, and they see Platonish thinking as a way of making sense of that. So Coleridge says, every man is either a Platonist or an Aristotelian, by which he means they're either kind of materially oriented or spiritual and mystical. So it's like my wife, Aristotelian, me, Platonist. You actually can play that game and divide everybody up that way. So he takes a very broad view of Platonism. And there's this romantic sense, too, with Coleridge, Tolkien, Lewis, the Sehnsucht, this desire for more, which is most often played out in the context of the natural world. The Hendrickson cover strikes me as very Tolkienian in that way. Evocative of the beauty we can never quite grasp, right? We touch it, but we can't hold on to it, which is, well, yeah. So, and that could be construed in a Platonic fashion, that the idea of the thing never quite realizes itself, and we're always left wanting for more. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable mode of thinking to approach some of the biblical truth.
Question right here.
Hi, Dr. McDonough. Thank you for sharing with us. After working on our 15 to 20 page papers, we really admire that you could write a whole book. That's.
Well, I get a whole year to do it too, and nothing else. So
yeah. So, two different questions, but one has to do with preaching. If you were going to do a sermon series in a church, how would you put that together, covering, let's say, some of the creation things? Would it be a 6-week series or a 6 months, or how would you determine?
It's the accordion principle. I always say everything can be compressed into a footnote or expanded to a multi-volume life work, right? So I think you can have a nice 4-part Sunday evening sermon series: creation, counter-creation, decreation, recreation. You could do that out of Genesis 1 through 11, or you could go Genesis to Revelation. You could just any number of things. You could do a 7-part series of 6 of this and then a rest. I mean, you get clever about it, but you could do it for a year with that motif and working through the whole canon. So I think the key is when you have a clear sense of what's going on, then the possibilities for how you deliver that become endless. It's when you don't know what you're doing that things just get out of control. Remember, Quinn Walters used to have the class, I don't know if you guys do it, planning the year's preaching. but I'm sure you still emphasize that idea that you don't have to just wake up on Friday morning and say, oh, 2 days, what am I going to do here? You plan it out, but you can plan it out in all sorts of ways. Compress it, one sermon, you can do the whole four-fold thing, or just spread it out as long as you like.
Recognizing that as people, we're not the only objects in the created order, and your love for animals, more specifically dogs.
Yeah, Jesu.
What, and I think culturally, sort of our current understanding of animal treatments, things like that. Where do you see non-human created things in the new creation?
Sure, and again, we could return to Job 38 and following, where God cares about the rock badgers and gazelles and microbes. God cares about everything, and we are put in stewardship over those things, according to Genesis, and we want to have, to the extent possible, a friendly dominion over the world. I love my dog. Scott loves his dog. I haven't told you, Scott, but we've renamed or nicknamed my dog the Secretary of Education. So now when I bring her in to school, people say, well, what's happening? You say, oh, we're visiting with the Secretary of Education. And then it'll sound like a good academic enterprise. But we're meant to nurture the world. And that's playing with your dog, especially a dog. I don't want to talk about other animals, but you know, I shared this in class the other day. When Odysseus comes back after his 20 years or more of wandering across the Aegean, who's the only one who recognizes him? His dog. And you know what his dog does? With its dying breath, it comes out to meet him and say hello. And you know, yeah, that you say, well, that's fictional, but that's how dogs are. That's a little glimpse of paradise, this happy relationship. Now you got a Bengal tiger carrying off your kids. I was thinking about this, that, you know, Hamilton plans to deal with coyote problem. Importing Bengal tigers. Yes, it's solved. And, oh, unintended consequences. You know, then you got there's a tooth and claw dimension too that has to be dealt with. So animal testing, I think that is absolutely something that needs to be talked about. There's not an obvious answer there, but there are times when you have to make difficult decisions in a broken world. And the prospect of X number of monkeys being sacrificed for X number of humans, it's a difficult calculus, but I think sometimes you've got to do that. And that's why these, you know, it's easy to mock the chicken-loving PETA people, PETA, people for the ethical treatment of animals, and they do go rather overboard at times, but there's, as in most things, there's an aspect of biblical truth that they're holding on to, that we do need to respect the whole world, because God's made it all. And particularly, I hate to say in evangelicalism, there's a tendency to reduce the creation to humanity and then reduce humanity to invisible souls. And then you lose the grandeur of what God's doing. You lose your ethical compass as well. But you need to preserve the integrity of God's creation project, the fullness of it.
Questions over here?
I was wondering if, as you were tracking through the various theologians throughout the ages, was there anything that struck you as a thread which started to develop that you felt by the time you reached Barth, it had become fully developed, and maybe it's something that you see as needs corrective?
Oh, I thought it was a positive thing, and then there was a twist at the end of the story.
It was inductive.
I guess I don't take generally a developmental view of stuff, because it smacks to me of a little bit of modern hubris, that everything's just getting better and better, which is also a way of saying things have, up to this point, been worse, and worse until me. And I take it much more swirly that people have insights proper to their time and their mode of being in the world, and expressed within certain culturally particular words and concepts and all that. And we do the exact same thing. I don't know that our insights to God are any better. I mean, is it better than Moses on the mountain the Lord, compassionate and gracious, showing mercy to thousands, judging in threes. I don't know, that says it all for me. So I take it as swirl. I think we're in a, yeah, there has perhaps been a tendency to undervalue the created order as such, though, again, I don't think that's universal by any means. So I don't take things in a developmental way. I think the central core confessional elements have always been there in the good thinkers, those who are paying attention to the scriptures. And we screw it up in various ways. And we often, imagine we're not screwing it up somehow simply by virtue of it being now. And that's delusional.
Hi. Yeah, it might be a silly question, but it's simple. I've been thinking about this question sometimes, many times. So why did God create the world and us? Even though He knew what we are, and
Excellent. So why did God create? And of course, there are two things going on there. Why did God create, and then why would God create a world which would end up the way it ended up? So they're actually two very distinct questions. Now, the first answer, and the best answer, and the only answer is because He wanted to. Right? Now, if you read some Barth, you say He's the one who loves in freedom, which is a nice way of putting it. But God is perfectly free and decides to posit something other than Himself. As just now, at times that becomes the language of overflowing or effulgence. His generosity leads Him to create. And even somebody as circumspect as Barth will talk in those terms at times, how much more the Eastern folks who don't mind talking that way quite as much. But you don't want to see that as a necessary emanation of His being, because then you're just collapsing God into the world. And the biggest thing I learned through this whole project is, and it's put best in the first 100 pages of Sergius Bulgakov's book, Unfading Light, is the central confession or the central statement of the God in the world problem is God must be absolutely distinct from the world and intimately involved with the world. And those two things are simultaneously true. And if you accept that, most of your theological problems don't go away, but they do have somewhere to go to, namely this mind-expanding paradox that God must be absolutely distinct, not just bigger than the world, but completely other than the world, and the world at every instant owes its existence ever and always only to God. So the fact that there is something there other than God is, at the end of the day, you can only say because God decided to do it. Now, it's a reflection of His glory. Edwards is really good in this in concerning the end for which God created the world, details of which are available in the book. So there are all sorts of knock-on effects of His having created the world, which redound to His glory, but ultimately it's His decision and His freedom. And then why would He create a world that gets so messed up? That drags us into the very interesting question of God and time, which we got a chapter on that, although time is one thing we don't have much of in real terms here. But God's relation to the temporal order is a tricky business, right? Totem simul. God experiences everything all at once. So it's always hard to parse that out. Augustine, really good on that in the Confessions. Barth has some interesting stuff on time and eternity as well. But I think the ultimate answer, the way I put it is, if we imagine the good created order as a kind of hemisphere, right? So here's the world God posits, which is just unremittingly good. Whatever He knows or doesn't know or foreknows or post-knows or whatever. There we go. So humans, by their defiance of God, their counter-creation, with the aid of Satan, create this whole anti-universe which is a mockery. It's parasitical upon the good. It's, in some sense, nothingness, and yet is there. It's a real paradox, right? We take this path away from God, which is a path into nothingness, and we open up this whole other, we think, dimension of reality, except it's sort of an unreal reality. And what we do is, in that darkness, we say, God can't reach us here. We found a place, even though it's no place, even though it's just sin and misery and death, but we have escaped God. And what God does, and this is again of pastoral import, is he takes that deviant path to nowhere and in Jesus makes it his own. So when he cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? He fully occupies the negative no space that we've created in our willful disobedience and made that his as well. And that's one way I riff off of Paul's sense that through Christ, God becomes all in all. That he not only occupies the good place of light that he has posited in his love and freedom, he also takes our wayward space and makes it his own, and it becomes a beautiful place because it's beautified by the sacrificial love of Jesus. And you look at your own life, that's what your story is, right? That your sin is not intrinsically good. It's nothingness. It's horrible. But it becomes the arena for God to display his glorious love. And so there we are.
Well, thank you. This is a great discussion for us to have. Where my mic went way down here. This is a great discussion for us to have in terms of a framework, a paradigm that we keep in the back of our heads as we look at creation, counter-creation, decreation, and then recreation. And what you help us to do is to see how historically the church has put these things together. The question for us as preachers is, how do we do that in the pulpit? One of the things that we don't want to do is to have a bunch of fun facts to know and tell about the Bible. But to be able to see how there's this cohesive narrative, this cohesive story, this cohesive theology. You look at homiletics, and there are certain paradigms that are often used in homiletics, like law, Lutherans' law, gospel. In the sermon, law is given, gospel is given. Even this could be used in some ways, in a sense, as a paradigm in homiletics: creation, counter-creation, decreation, and recreation, in a sense. It's a fruitful consideration as you look at the task of preaching. So thank you, Dr. McDonough, for being with us and stimulating our thinking. And as you see, there are the flyers on the tables, and the book's going to be out
soon. Soon. Engus is the biblical word. Yeah, as soon as we can, we're getting it out. And it's Hendrickson. It's right down the street, so it'll be, just keep that poster on your mirror every day and hope and wish that it'll come out, and then it will come out. Maybe in time for Christmas.
Yeah, and everybody can get one in their stocking.
That's right. It'll fit right in there.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in the spring.